What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. St. Paul's, Minnesota, would birth two fighting brothers, Mike and Tom Gibbons. Now, Tom Gibbons would get a shot at the World Heavyweight Championship contest. It would be against the Manasseh Moeller, Jack Dempsey. Fight would take place at Shelby, Montana. And unfortunately for that town, they would go bankrupt because that town invested their entire savings in Tom Gibbons. Don't know if he went around, but I can tell you that Jack Dempsey walked out of that town $200,000 richer as he requested his money up front. But Tom Gibbons would not be discouraged. He would take on a fighting Marine, Gene Tunney, the Pittsburgh Windmill, Harry Greb. Now, the Harry Greb fight was a charity event. It was a milk fund. But Harry Greb would show why he was one of the greatest middleweights and not a bad light heavyweight of all times. But Tom Gibbons would have an older brother. His name was Mike Gibbons. And I would like to discuss his career with you right here on the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. Now, Mike Gibbons was known as the St. Paul Phantom. He was born July 20th, 1897 in St. Paul, Minnesota. He died August 31st, 1956, would be the year, by the way, of the death of the great Sam Langford, known as the Boston Bone Crusher. But Mike would die in St. Paul, Minnesota. He stood 5'9", weighed 145 to 160.5 pounds. He had a total bout career of 132 contests. And Mike would reign against middleweights such as Jimmy Clabby, losing 10 rounds in a decision in St. Paul's, September 11th, 1909. Mike walked into the ring with a record of 12 wins, no losses, 1 draw, with 3 knockouts. Jimmy Clabby walked into the ring with a 38 winning streak, 6 losses, 13 draws, with 23 knockouts. Now, shortly after the death of the world middleweight champion Stanley Ketchel, who was known as the Michigan Assassin, Mike Gibbons would gain claim of middleweight champion. After 16 fights between January 11th, 1908 and December 10th, 1909, Mike would have 15 contests, engaging in 77 rounds of boxing. Between January 8th, 1911 and December 4th, 1912, Mike had 25 contests, engaging of 278 rounds of boxing experience. He'd be involved with fights with strong middleweights like Jimmy Clabby, September 1st and September 29th, totaling 25 rounds of no decisions. Jimmy Clabby, who was he? He was known as the Indiana Wasp. He was born July 14, 1890, Norwalk, Connecticut. He died January 18, 1934, in Carmel City, Indiana. He stood 5'8.5", weighed 131.25 to 162 pounds. And Clabby was recognized as the welterweight champion in Louisiana State, an Australian lightweight championship of New Zealand, middleweight championship of Australia, and the lightweight championship of Louisiana. He defeated Willie K.O. Brennan, and Arthur Cripps, George Cook Cripps, and Dave Smith, Albert Pooley, Mike Gibbons, Eddie McCarthy. Between May 2nd and June 13th of 1913, he would face men such as George Chipp, Jeff Smith, Al McCoy, and Les Dorsey. 1912, Mike Gibbons would face Tommy Hall, February 17th. Fought him in Philadelphia. 6 rounds, no decision. 1914, February 16th to be exact. Be involved in 6 rounds, no decision contest with Perry Kid Graves, out of Philadelphia. Now, Perry Ivan Graves was the only man second in boxing history to stop Harry Graves due to a broken bone in his arm. He was only the second fighter. First fighter was Joe Chip. He stopped him in 1913. Share a short story with you. Joe Chip, who was the brother of George Chip. George Chip would become middleweight champion when he would defeat Frank Klaus. But Joe Chip would knock out Harry Graves. Harry Graves would say that would be the hardest punch that he would ever receive. But Joe Chip would be in a corner in 1919 of Jack Dempsey when he would take on Jess Willard for the World Heavyweight Championship title. Now, in the corner of Jess Willard, you had a Harry Graves opponent. His name was Walter Monahan. He's the one who made claims of Jack Dempsey having loaded gloves in his right hand. Because Jess Willard would receive such a beating that no man would ever receive from a smaller man. Jack Dempsey weighed less than 190 pounds. Jess Willard weighed over 200 pounds. And I mentioned to you that Joe Chip was in the corner of Jack Dempsey. And he was the first man to knock out Harry Graves. And I also mentioned to you that Harry Graves stated that was the hardest punch he ever received. And I also mentioned to you that Walter Monahan had laid claims of Jack Dempsey having loaded gloves. And they would name that right hand of Jack Dempsey Iron Mike. Well, Mike Tyson, who was once named the Baby Bull and Kid Dynamite, had changed his name to Iron Mike because he admired the right hand of Jack Dempsey. With Joe Chip, who was in the corner of Jack Dempsey, and like I stated, he was the first man to knock out Harry Graves. And once again, I stated that Harry Graves would state that that was the hardest punch he ever received. You figure out the rest. Now, exactly who was Kid Graves? He was born July 11th, 1892 in Rocks Bluff, Nebraska. He died July 24th, 1963 in Plattsmouth, Nebraska. He stood 5'7", weighed 125 to 151.5 pounds, and he was managed by Alvin Pops Graves. Pops Graves was the father of Kid Graves. Perry Graves took claim of the welterweight championship crown 1914 after stopping Johnny Kidd Albert. And when Kidd was successful in that reign, the world middleweight champion, Michigan assassin Stanley Ketchel, had died in 1910. Graves would stake claim of the world middleweight championship contest, along with fighters such as Ray Bronson and Clarence Kid Fern, future world welterweight champion Jack Britton and Ted Kid Lewis, Jimmy Clappy, Jimmy Gardner, Mike Grover. Now, Perry Kid Graves would stake claim to the welterweight championship, but he would also stake claim to middleweight championship. But yet he was a welterweight at that time, and Sam Langford never staked claim of that title because he was not allowed to. But Graves would face Jacob Soldier Barfield, Ted Kid Lewis 3 times, Italian Joe Gans, and Mike Grover 2 times, Harry Graves and Mike O'Dowd, battling Hurley 3 times, and Ted Kid Lewis, Johnny Kid Alberts, Jack Britton 5 times. He would face the world middleweight champion, Al McCoy, February 23rd, 1914 in Brooklyn. It would be a no decision, 10 rounds. Now, Al McCoy would KO George Chipp, April 7th, 1914. He would win the World Middleweight Championship crown from Frank Klaus. After 40 bouts of fighting men such as Harry Greb, Jack Dillon, George Chipp, Jimmy Clary, Willie Lewis, Soldier Jacob Bauerfield, Willie K.O. Brennan, Thomas Silent Martin, the Zulu Kid, Billy Grubb, who was the owner, by the way, of the famous gym located on 116th Street, Harlem, New York, July 20th, 1914. It would be known as the famous Grubbs Gym. Billy Grubbs was the owner. And that gym would produce great fighters, such as Danny Cox, Walker Smith, who was known as Sugar Ray Robinson, Louis Spider Valentine, Sandy Sadler, George Godfrey, who was the Leaperville Shadow, Harry Smith, known as the Harlem Thunderbolt, Jack McVeigh, Johnny Wilson, who would become the middleweight champion, Jeff Smith, Jerome Jeffords, and many other great fighters. So Billy Grubbs was an opponent of Al McCoy. August 9th, 1921, Mike Gibbons would face the Bayonne Globetrotter. His name was Jeff Smith, Jerome Jeffords. Born April 23rd, 1891 in Harlem, New York. He died February 3rd, 1962. That would be the year that Benny Kid Perrette would die in a ring after a contest with Emil Griffin, where Jeffords would reside in Levittown, New Jersey. Weighed 155 to 166 pounds, had 190 bouts with 28 losses. He faced fighters such as George Chipp, Joe Burrell, Les Darcy, Zulu Kid, Clay Turner, Chuck Wiggins, Jamaica Kid, Lee Anderson, Frank Mantell, Bob Mohawk, Mike Mateague, and Jimmy Clary. Now, Mike Mateague would become the light heavyweight champion when he would defeat Balansiki on St. Patrick's Day in Ireland. Lee Anderson would become the colored light heavyweight champion. He would defeat William Ward, Kid Norfolk. Les Darcy would be the Australian middleweight champion of the world. Joe Burrell, who was originally from Brooklyn, New York, and he would reside in Philadelphia. He had some very good middleweights during that time. Mike Gibbons was in the thick of things. I consider Mike Gibbons a better fighter than Tom Gibbons, but I also consider him one of the greatest middleweights of all times. No question about it. Now, Mike Gibbons, after retirement, he would take on a young man by the name of Russell Anderson. And he'd be given the name of Jimmy Gibbons, no relations to the Gibbons brothers. He was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, died in St. Paul, Minnesota, fought between 1928 and 1933. He had a total bout career of 23 bouts, 19 wins, 2 losses, 14 knockouts, and he was stopped twice. He defeated Tommy Havel, 5 wins, 1 draw. Mike would retire while becoming a businessman, state commissioner, as well as a trainer. Mike Gibbons would retire blind in one eye, and he was elected to the Ring Boxing Hall of Fame, 1958, International Boxing Hall of Fame, 1992, and the Minnesota Boxing Hall of Fame in 2010. Mike Gibbons, outstanding fighter. And I just wanted to recognize Mike Gibbons. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. All great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. Now, I'd like to take this time to congratulate Hardline Boxing on a phenomenal project covering 1,000 of the greatest fighters of all times. That was some project. And it gives you an outlook on some of the greatest fighters and those who don't get recognized. So shout out to Hardline Boxing for a job well done.